Radhika, you once compared teams that just keep working hard without a clear vision to stormtroopers. Like they all look the same, they follow orders, and somehow they just never hit the target. So my question for you is, in everyday life, what kind of stormtrooper armor do we put on that makes us feel stuck and less happy or fulfilled?
This analogy, it really came to me because I feel like the stormtrooperism is often what society pushes us towards. And so let me first of all unpack the stormtrooperism a little bit. And then we can talk about, how I see this manifesting in everyday life. The stormtrooperism approach is where we are constantly doing lots of activity. The stormtroopers in the movie, they fire lots, they're running around. There's lots of frantic activity, but they don't seem to have any sort of a meaningful impact, right? And the contrast to that is the Jedi approach. It's a very small group, and yet they seem to have an outsized impact. There's this tiny little Yoda who seems to be able to lift, big planes out of the water, this sort of outsized impact because they're very disciplined. They sense, they experiment, learn, adapt, right? Versus stormtroopers, just lots of activity, but not achieving anything. And the way society pushes us towards this is, we're trained, I think, from childhood to always think about this achievement and like, what is achievement, and like pursuing lots of things that society deems is the right thing, right? It's all these goals that society sets for us. It's the right job title, the big house, the big car, etc. It's chasing all of this sort of achievement. But do we always achieve what matters to us? And that's stormtrooperism. And the contrast to that is, in the Jedi mindset, you're not necessarily chasing all of these things. It's a deeper question, right? And it's a deeper question of what is meaningful? What is that force inside you? What is the force that you sense? And so I guess that for me is the big difference. And the way it manifests is we do all of this chasing like stormtroopers in our everyday lives, but without feeling like we're really achieving that much. It's never enough, right? Life is exhausting. It's tiring. We're chasing one thing after the next. And this is something that I have experienced personally as well. And I'm happy to talk more too about that.
Now that I'm listening to you, I would say that this just leads to burnout. It's not, we don't find that inner fulfillment, but when you're just doing some tasks that don't have meaning, or maybe you are totally misaligned with your purpose, with your values, and then you are just, but because somebody said that you need to do that, then you're just following those invisible orders. Maybe it's not the boss, maybe it's somebody on TikTok said that you need to do that in order to achieve your goals that you have. What's your take on this?
I think that is so true. Not only that it is sort of handed to us and we don't think about it, but it is that we've so internalized that this is what we should be pursuing that we don't really question whether it is actually what we want. I'll give you, I guess, a personal example. I grew up in India till I was 12. Then I lived in South Africa. I moved to South Africa in 1991. It was just after the apartheid laws were abolished, and I lived there till 1995, which is just after the first democratic elections. So I lived in South Africa really during momentous years. And in those years, when I went to live there, I first was in a black school, and I was one of just less than a handful of not non-blacks. And then 3/4 of the way through that year, I moved to a white school where I was the second non-white in the whole school, the first in my class. And that was a situation where, from when I was 12 until I was 17, I was in an environment where I constantly had to prove myself. That being that second non-white in the school, it was assumed that I wasn't smart, and, I had to constantly prove. In fact, the school said to me that they weren't going to, I was too young for my class. I was 2 years younger than all the other kids in my class. And they said to me that before I could move to the next grade, I had to prove myself that in just 1/4 of the year, I had to learn all the material from everything that they had taught in 3/4 of the year. And only if I could prove that, then they would move me to the next year. Otherwise, they'd set me back. And that was a really painful proposition. Again, I had to prove myself. But this mindset of constantly having to prove myself, and by the way, I did it, right? I did it, I achieved, and I was praised for my achievement. I was recognized for it. But it created this cycle of constantly having to prove myself and then being praised for what I had managed to achieve. And then over time, it creates the cycle that, you are what you achieve. And by the way, in terms of achievements, I have plenty that I could talk about. I went to MIT, studied electrical engineering. I had startups under my name. I've been through 5 acquisitions, two of which were companies that were ones that I founded. Oh, and I wrote a book, Radical Product Thinking, which was published by, not self-published, but rather published by a traditional publisher. So there are a ton of accomplishments that I can talk about. But, maybe like 5 years ago, there was a point where I was thinking about taking a full-time job. And it was a time when I was really stressed in my life. And my husband said to me, what are you trying to prove and to whom? And that question really hit me to the core. Like, what was I still trying to? And I think this is what I mean for our listeners, that we're constantly pursuing the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, but it's never, ever enough.
Yeah. You think this is like something that women do? Because my husband asked me the same question.
I think, especially if you're a high achieving woman, I think this is very natural. I don't know if, we even notice this anymore, but there was one time where I was with my daughter and we went to a store and, the credit card wasn't, for whatever reason, going through. And the store owner, rather than assuming whatever, sometimes there's a glitch, whatever, but he assumed I don't know how to use the credit card. Like, how ridiculous is that, right? And my daughter was shocked because this was the first time she had seen this. She was shocked. She was saying to me, what is wrong with that guy? Why does he treat you like you're an idiot? And I was like, oh, darling, this is the first time you're seeing it. But this is what happens so often. You get patronized a lot if you're a woman. And this happens to women so often that we just sort of dismiss it like, yeah, one more incident. But there was a brilliant TED talk by someone who transitioned from being a man to being a woman. And one of the phrases this person used was, by becoming a woman, apparently overnight I had become stupid because people felt like they needed to explain things to me. So this is something that happens for women. If you're smart, you constantly have to prove how good you are, right? And especially if you're smart and good looking, somehow those two concepts are very hard for people to hold together in their minds. And so because you have to constantly prove yourself, this is so ingrained in us that we constantly have to keep achieving and show, yes, that, I have substance.
Yeah. And we are on this pursuit to perfection, even though perfection doesn't,
And it's a pursuit to perfection where I think people give very superficial advice, like, oh, come on, stop being a perfectionist, you're just getting in your own way. Well, yeah, that's just because your lived experience is that you haven't had to do that. Especially if you're a woman who is, let's say, you've had to be an immigrant or you're a person of color. This this factor is sort of doubled and tripled in your life, in your lived experience. For me, moving from India to South Africa, having to prove myself, not just because I'm a person of color in South Africa, but also because I'm an immigrant, I am different, I don't speak with the same accent as the other South Africans. Like, there's so many reasons why this effect is doubled and tripled in you. I think this is what a lot of people experience, and it is just ingrained in you in layers and layers that takes a very long time to unpack.
you said you speak 9 languages. So how did that shape your view of the world? Because I know we use languages like differently. I'm learning now Arabic, I'm living in Dubai, so I see how they shape the sentences. It's totally different than we do. And I think when you learn some new language, you also see that culture a bit differently. How is
Yes.
that for you?
Oh, I so agree. I've said for a long time that I speak 9 languages, but if you ask me where is home, I have a very difficult time answering that. But languages are like a portal to any culture. It gives you a deeper understanding both of that culture, but also makes you closer to those people. So I speak Italian, and when I speak Italian, a lot of people actually think I am Italian, which I'm not. But, when I travel in Italy, there have been times where, we went to this one cafe, we were having breakfast, and, we were chit-chatting with the owner. And, because they thought I was Italian and, being friendly, it opens up experiences that a tourist would never have had in that setting. We were telling them about how much we like those almond, or no, it was actually apricot croissants. And
Mm.
they were just, they were like, we'll wait for you tomorrow to come back. And we did go back the next day. It was just such a beautiful experience. It was another place that we went to in Tuscany where, this owner kept bringing us plates of food to taste. Not that we were paying for it. He just saw how enthusiastic we were about and such foodies that we were. And he was passionate about what he was cooking. So he'd bring things out and go like, oh, taste this and taste this. And at the end, when we went to pay the bill, he wouldn't even take a tip, like, and it was just a cultural experience that language opens up because it gets you to have so much in common with people. And
Mhm.
it gives you a sense of the culture and become closer to those people and the culture to fit in.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of so many stories. But did you maybe, when you were learning this and seeing like different patterns in different languages, in different cultures, did you maybe also from those things, like from environment, get some inspiration for your work?
Uh, I
Like
think
this
my
puzzle setting and this kind of stuff that you're talking about?
It's so fascinating. I hadn't thought about that question in particular, but I think my entire life has been about pattern matching.
Hmm.
I remember, um, I remember that, early in my career, I started in electrical engineering, and then, my first job was in my startup, and I took on the sales role because nobody else wanted to do that role. I figured I would do that. But, finding patterns in how you do sales and how that becomes a life skill, where, there was a mentor who taught me that whether you are trying to get out of a parking ticket or interviewing for a job, it's sales as a life skill. But that same pattern I realized about product, that when I learned how to build products, I realized building products is like a life skill. Product is about what is the change you want to bring to the world, and your product is your mechanism to create that change. And so, it's a way of matching that pattern so that even parenting becomes a product because you want to create change in the world through the children that you're launching in the world. And you can think very systematically about what are the patterns you want to bring to your kids. Going back to my current work about puzzle setting and puzzle solving, I've realized that all of learning is about puzzle setting and puzzle solving. It's not about setting goals. One of my first experiences and the way it relates to language is I remember when I was 3 years old, we had moved from North India to living in South India. So in North India, the place where I was living was near Mumbai, and they speak Marathi. And when we moved to the South, they speak Tamil, which is a different script, a different language altogether. It's about as similar as, living in Germany and then going to Russia and learning a new language. And so when we moved to the South, I remember this, I have this distinct memory as a 3 year old of going downstairs to play in this puddle. And there was another girl there, and I was trying to talk to her. And I was fascinated that she was saying things and I was saying things, and we weren't understanding each other at all. And to me, then from there on, it was like this puzzle of figuring out what she was saying and how to say things back to her, right? But I think all of life, for me, the realization has been only recently, though, that's one of the things I've unpacked, that all of learning happens because we subconsciously set puzzles and solve puzzles. We don't even think about it explicitly. But once we start to make the structure explicit, we are so much more effective, whether at work or in our personal lives, in terms of learning, reflecting on those learnings, and therefore adapting. And a lot of my current work is about how do we make that explicit so that we can make that reflection, experimentation, learning, adaptation more efficient.
Oh, that's really interesting. Because in my space, we are always, you need to have some kind of a goals or visions, or at least something to go towards, to orient yourself where you want to go. And I've never thought about like those puzzles. Yeah, it makes sense. So it's like
But
watching a TV and then just seeing all these parts and just putting it together, and then it works.
I think the point that you made about vision, I definitely think that is super important. It's
Mhm.
important to have vision to know what puzzle am I going to solve. To me, what I said earlier about your product is your mechanism to create change in the world. You do need to have a clear vision for what is the change that I want to create. And I don't mean one of these, just bullshit sort of visions. Like Facebook has this vision of to be open and or to create a world that's open and connected. What does that
Mhm.
even mean? It's not a vision that is talking about a problem that needs to be solved in the world. And when you don't have a clear vision, you can see the kind of change Facebook brings to the world, and it's not necessarily positive. And so
Yeah.
I think that clarity in vision is really important. And thinking about what is the problem that I want to solve in the world, and therefore, what is my product to create that change, right? I think that is really important. But I think once you have that clarity of vision, the way we achieve change is, I love this phrase. It says, man plans, God laughs. You can have whatever change you want to create. You can have whatever vision, you can plan anything, but that's not how it pans out. Like things get in the way. And so puzzle
Mhm.
setting and puzzle solving is how you overcome those obstacles and you're able to create that change you want. And the distinction I want to draw is between goals versus vision. So vision is about the problem you want to see solved in the world and what is that change you want to bring. But goals is very often about, it's outcomes that we try to pursue
Mhm.
in terms
Metrics.
of numbers and metrics. And like I want to get to either revenues of X million dollars or build a $1 billion company. In personal life, it might be, I want to get to this job title or whatever. Those are goals. And that I think
Mhm.
is the problem. But vision is really important to have.
I totally agree. But the vision is also an intimate relationship with possibility. And maybe a question, when did you first learn to trust yourself? Like this is a big theme now in my community with my people for December, like how to learn how to self-trust.
Isn't that a lifelong journey?
It is. But yeah, we need to start somewhere with small steps.
I can share kind of how this journey has been unraveling for me, right? Or
Hmm.
unfolding rather. So in my early 20s, that first startup that I talked about that we started, right out of our dorm rooms at MIT, I started that with four co-founders. The four co-founders were men, and I was the only woman in this. And I remember at the time, except for one of those co founders, who is now my husband, but the other three were guys who had so much confidence, who just seemed to always know all the right answers. They just apparently knew how to build a business and how to make it successful, etc. And they sounded so confident that, I often found myself going along with whatever they were saying. Although inside me, I always had this conflict. I was like, well, it doesn't sound right, but clearly you seem to know better. And it was only after that experience when that startup didn't go well, and I looked back on all of those experiences and those decisions that I went along with, and I realized I'm never, ever going to do that again because I had to be true to myself. And a lot of the work that I've done since, whether in writing my first book, Radical Product Thinking, or now questioning goal setting, a lot of it goes against conventional wisdom. In Radical Product Thinking, where I came up with a radical vision statement that talks about a detailed problem statement as opposed to coming up with bullshit visions like to be the leader and blah, blah. Questioning what a lot of people have said to write a detailed vision that sounds more like an essay. A lot of that, was being able to look within and say, I don't agree with what's happening. I see my personal experiences don't match what people have said. It doesn't match conventional wisdom, and which is why I've been able to question it. But I think a lot of it has really been unpacking a lot of what we've grown up with. I would say, and that unpacking really started in my early 40s, late 30s, maybe. Um, and it's continued until now. I feel like I'm further along in that unpacking now. And that unpacking starts all the way with, what have we learned in our childhood? For me, a lot of it has been about achievement and being seen for my achievements, being the one who is very empathetic and who's able to cater to other people's needs, but not being able to look within and understand even some of my own needs. But unpacking so much of that all the way from childhood and then being able to say, okay, what do I feel? And being able to trust that, being able to look within and trust that. And there are two books that I'll mention one. There's one book that I've found to be truly fundamental in unpacking so much of this. The book is titled The Drama of the Gifted Kid. Oh no, The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller. I find it to be a brilliant book that really has helped me understand myself and be in touch more with what do I think about things and trusting that.
Is there any advice that you would give somebody who is listening and is struggling maybe with that? How to trust myself more? Just one little step, one tiny step.
Wow, that's a really hard one. I think to be able to get to that point of how do I trust myself, the unpacking your childhood and your beliefs, etc., is so important that I'd start with a bigger question. Are you at a point where you can unpack all of that? I will share that, when I was reading this book, Drama of the Gifted Child, I was listening to the audiobook and I was listening to it on a flight flying from Romania to Boston. And I was sobbing on that flight as I was reading this book, right? And I didn't care who was near me or wondering what's going on. But like the book, helped me grieve for so many things that I had never really unpacked. And so, but not everyone is at a point where you feel like, yes, I'm ready to unpack all of that. So, how much do you care about trusting yourself and wanting that confidence to wanting that more fulfilling life? If, uh, in terms of vision, I always talk about why is the status quo unacceptable? When you describe a problem statement in the vision, the next question in the radical product thinking, the vision statement is here's the problem statement, but why must you solve it? Maybe things are fine the way they are. And unless you can answer that question in a way that is deeply meaningful to you, you don't have that drive to solve that problem. And that drive to solve that problem can then manifest in what is the end state that you want to achieve. And to me, that in terms of a personal vision at the moment, the problem statement is, how has my upbringing shaped me? And I feel like without understanding that, I cannot fully trust myself. I cannot live this fully meaningful life. That is why the status quo is unacceptable. And the end state I envision is that I want to really understand all of myself, embrace all of me, all of my flaws and my capabilities. And the way I'm bringing this about is through going through this journey of unpacking all of my experiences and understanding how those have shaped me. You can use the radical product thinking vision statement to write a personal vision statement. Basically, everything that I just shared, it's a paraphrased version of that fill in the blank statement. And that's in the radical product thinking book. But, although it's for the corporate world and writing a product vision, as I mentioned, it's just as applicable to our personal lives. If you can write such a vision statement and think about exactly why is the status quo unacceptable, you can start to feel like, okay, now I'm ready to unpack it. And then you can read all of these books.
Yeah, lovely said. Thank you. So now when you share that, I have a question. What's one story from your life that you maybe rarely share, but it shaped everything about who you are today?
Oh,
It fits into what you were talking now.
that is such a profound question. I can share two stories, one that is deeply personal and then one that is more of a corporate world, but both of which have shaped me profoundly. So, one that comes to mind that might seem just trivial for people. I was 12 and I remember being at an airport, and this was when we were traveling from India to South Africa. We were moving there for the first time. I remember at this airport, I had never opened a can of Coke at that time. I had always only, if I had ever had Coca Cola, it was always from a bottle, which you use a bottle opener with. I had never had it in a can. And I was 12 at the time. And I remember at the airport, I took this can and I was like, oh, interesting. And I shook it up and then I opened it. And I was just shocked at just the spray. Um, and I remember there was this guy who was lying next to us and he was sleeping and it was all over him. I woke him up with that. So the story is so memorable for me because I remember it being so embarrassed, just so embarrassed. And I just wanted the earth to open up and to hide, right? And it was the first experience. And I remember such a first experience where I was on the first time I was on a flight and I wasn't sitting next to my parents. And there was a meal on the flight and there's just so much stuff on that tray, and I was this little kid and I remember being overwhelmed by just how much stuff there was on the plate. And there was with me this girl who was maybe just a couple of years older than me, right? But she seemed so much older at the time. She was so kind about it. She was helping me unpack those things, and then she was taking some of that mess onto her tray because she had organized it all. But that story and this other airport story had two things in common. The kindness of that person next to me was just so touching, and it made it a lot more bearable. They could have made the experience so much worse. And it was such a learning moment for me. I have obviously never opened a can of Coke like that again. And, after that experience as a little girl, I knew how to unpack this tray of food when they give it to you on an airline, right? But so you learn very quickly, but it gave me this experience of how this kindness from someone witnessing your learning is so important. And I think as a leader, it has made me so much more empathetic in terms of just being beside someone who is learning something, how you can create space for them. Yes, they are still going to be embarrassed by maybe their learnings or a failure, but not making it feel like that. And that is the power of you as a witness in someone's learning. So that's the most important piece. And the second part of this learning from a corporate world in terms of the solution is, I find that in the corporate world, we have all of these goals, targets, etc. And I think psychologically, it just creates this feeling of anxiety in people. It creates the sense of burden and the sense of anxiety. How am I going to be evaluated? I have to hit this number because otherwise, how will people perceive me? How will my boss perceive me? I want them to see me as a high performer. And because we create this anxiety, then we artificially say all these mantras like, fail fast, learn fast. It's important to embrace failure. All of this bullshit that if you just think about a puzzle, right? If you think about the mindset you're in when you're trying to solve a Rubik's Cube, you don't make an attempt and then say, that was a failure. I'm going to embrace failure. And now I'm going to try again and learn from it. There's no such artificial thinking. You just make an attempt. You go like, oh yeah, that didn't work. Okay, what will I do next? And you just intuitively learn and adapt, right? And so the big question for me in the corporate world was, if we think back to how we learn from childhood, why do we then make learning so hard in the corporate world by, first of all, setting goals and targets, and then, artificially telling you to embrace failure, when all of that is just bullshit? Why can't we have this mindset of puzzle setting and puzzle solving? And so what I am working on now and what I'm writing about is this framework I've created for puzzle setting and puzzle solving so that we can create scaffolding and structure to make that a lot easier. Because what we do out of intuition is just really hard to translate into something explicit. Like we just do it intuitively. But if you can translate it into a framework, we know how to just do it systematically. And that makes it a lot more efficient. So that's how, these life experiences have brought me to what I'm working on now.
Yeah, interesting. And I think when we are thinking about success, I think this comes like so many words from military. It's just so directional. You need to do this and this and this in order to do that and that and that. And what you shared now, it's so more feminine. I have a feeling like you use intuition and also searching for the patterns and how to set the puzzles that you have maybe also some deeper meaning behind it, and not only what is success anyway, if you would
Oh, I want
like.
to,
Yeah, just go.
before we get to what is success, we'll get to that in a moment. I want to, you said this is a more feminine way, and you mentioned intuition. You know, that is to me so fascinating. To me, you said feminine. I thought the words you were going to use is this is so much more human. And isn't it interesting that society, this whole label that we put to it is feminine rather than intuition? Oh, sorry, rather than human.
Human.
Because we sort of make it seem like this is, whenever something seems more feminine, people almost use it like a derogatory term, right? And, or that is traditionally what culture has, the way it's framed it. And if you think about, this is just a more human way to do it. But the reason we perceive it, even in a good way, as more feminine is because often the toxic masculinity way has de-emphasized all of these approaches. What you just said about this being such a military way of thinking, etc. I also associated with toxic masculinity, and instead, like, this is just a more human and effective way of
Yeah.
working.
Yeah, nicely said.
But I'd love to hear your thoughts, but we can go back to what is success, or we can talk about what puzzle setting and puzzle solving is. There's so many ways, different paths we can take from here.
Let's go to puzzle setting and puzzle solving. Yeah, for this masculinity, femininity. I think we both, men and women, we both have it, everything inside of us, and it's a nice, complex way and mixture. And yeah, if we could just learn how to use it in a human way, like you said, that would be so beautiful. Also,
Yeah.
men needs to be tender sometimes, and women need to be like set boundaries and be assertive when we need to be. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
And it's fascinating you mentioned being tender versus boundaries. I think all of that sort of goes together.
Hmm.
You can be tender and
And set boundaries and
set
assertive.
boundaries. But it's interesting how we tend to polarize it even in our own minds. It's
Hmm.
masculine versus feminine, tender versus boundaries, and yet all of it is one. That this is sort of the way all of these are inherent to our ways of being. But going to this question of, okay, how do you do puzzle setting and puzzle solving?
Hmm.
So let's talk about puzzle setting first. And I'll talk about this in the corporate world, but also in our personal lives. In the corporate world, a goal approach might be achieve X million revenues by the end of this year. In terms of setting it as a puzzle, it might be that, we do want to hit X million by the end of the year, but I see a problem. And the observation that I have is that we grew in the last 3 years, we've plateaued in the last year. And then you ask open questions, things you genuinely don't know answers to. So this might be things like, what is happening? Is there something in the market that has shifted fundamentally and we just haven't adapted to it yet? Is it that maybe our sales team knew how to talk to the early adopters, but we didn't learn how to talk to the mass market? Is it that maybe our product was working for the early adopters, but we haven't figured out how to meet the needs of the mass market? So these are open questions. And the objective is the summary of what we want to set out and solve, which is how do we get back to that growth trajectory by figuring out this puzzle? So that's setting the puzzle. And now you can use this in your personal life too. Instead of, I want to run a marathon by the end of this year, you might frame it as a puzzle. And that might be, what are things that one might need to do for a marathon? It's things I genuinely don't know. What would the training theme look like? What do I have the time to do this? And do I want to do this? Those might be open questions. You're genuinely curious. Or why do I want to do this? That might be something with genuine curiosity that you explore. And so you've set the
If I
puzzle.
can
Yeah, go on.
jump in and just for those people, like, let's say you want to run a marathon and you don't want to set a goal, but instead of that, you ask yourself, what do I need in order to run a marathon till the end of the year? So, do I understand you correctly?
It's not just what do I need? It might be a lot of open questions that really come to you as you think about a marathon. If you approach it with curiosity, genuine curiosity, then what questions come to you? For me, if I think about running a marathon, the first question is, why do I want to do it? Like, what is my motivation for doing it? Is it for health reasons? Am I trying to prove something to myself? Those are the first questions that come to me. But for you, it might be different questions that come to you. It's just unpacking it for yourself to say, when you think about this puzzle of running a marathon, what are open questions you genuinely don't have answers to? You might already know for yourself why you want to run it. That's not even a question. The first questions are, how do I do this? What does my training schedule look like? Maybe it's more of a time. I've always wanted to run a marathon in my life. You don't even think about, what are those questions like, why do I want to do it? Like, I've just known all my life, this is what I want to do.
And if many people would ask themselves those questions, I think they would be happier with the trajectory of their life, because they wouldn't pursue somebody else's dreams and goals.
Yeah,
because
so
they would
true.
be more aligned with their heart's desires.
Yes.
That's so nicely said.
I so agree. I think this has been a big learning for me, that when I now pursue something, one of the first questions that comes to me is, why do I want to do this? What is it that's driving me to do this?
Mm.
And then the puzzle solving part comes in. So when you can, and the puzzle solving part, I now call it, the framework I call this is OLA. OH. The O stands for observe. So you've set the puzzle. Before you jump in and start solving it, just observe. Stay in the problem space, because you've asked all these questions. Don't just jump to, okay, I'm going to start training. Just observe for a moment, like, try to answer these questions, the biggest ones that came to you. Observe what you're seeing. Then you can start with the next letter, hypothesize. So OHLA is observe, hypothesize, learn, adapt. So the hypothesize is, you think about, what is your first attempt going to be? And then you try it. And then you ask the question, how well did it work? So in the corporate world, I might try a sales messaging, and I might say, how well did this messaging work? And the answer was, great, it worked well. And I am getting meetings with decision makers. On the marathon side, it might be, I observed, and now I thinking that, I want to run this for fitness reasons. That means, I want to be careful in my training. And, here are some programs that I found that might help me achieve this. Okay, so that's the how well did it work. Next question, what did I learn? Let's go back to the corporate example. The sales messaging, we had observed, we hypothesized and tried it. And now, I'm seeing, okay, what did I learn? I'm getting meetings with decision makers. Those meetings are happening, but it's not converting quickly. It looks like, I'm talking to the decision maker, but this, in the mass market, this decision maker looks different. There's a new group within the decision maker that I've never talked to before. So this is what I've learned. Maybe for your personal marathon case, it's that you're trying out this training regime, but you're realizing that it is just taking up too much time. And, there's something that I need to prioritize, that, I just don't have time for everything. So I have to decide, like, how much do I want to do this? And what are my priorities? Now, the last question. So we've answered, how well did it work? What have we learned? The last question. Based on the first two questions, what will you try next? So let's go back to the corporate example, sales. Now I know how well it's working. I'm getting meetings. I need to talk to this new group. What will I try next? I'm going to create a webinar to talk to this group I've never talked to before. I'm going to create new marketing material that the decision maker can easily forward to someone else. And so now I am going to try these actions, and then I can go back to puzzle solving and see how well is this new approach working. On the marathon side, maybe it's that, I look at my priorities and I realize that, I've been doing this book club. I've been also doing all this parent teacher association things. I've decided, I still want to do the parent teacher stuff, but book club, I really don't have time for it. And I'm not getting as much from it as I am from the marathon training. I'm going to drop that. And here are maybe a couple of other things that I'm going to drop and ask for help. And so this is what I'm going to try next. And now it starts that next cycle. So this is how we can think about puzzle setting and puzzle solving, where we just don't artificially create this thing of embracing failure. You're just constantly puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And sometimes it leads you all the way back to puzzle setting and go like, you know what? The nature of the puzzle has changed. I've learned so much. I've realized this is not the puzzle I want to solve. Maybe it's not the marathon I wanted to run. Maybe it was just fitness goals I had. That was all I wanted. Your puzzle changes.
How long do you stick with one puzzle and when do you change it? Because the question that I'm thinking about is, I've seen so many people, they are just trying this strategy and then there is no result in maybe 1 week, not this instant generation that everything needs to be right away or yesterday. When I decided it needs to be yesterday, and then they jump from one strategy to other strategy. And I could say those strategies are puzzles, but maybe they are not sticking with one puzzle long enough to see the results that it is bringing. So how do you differentiate those, which are the good puzzles and where I am too impatient to get the harvest?
I love this question. And it's a deeply personal one too. Okay, so there's a two-part answer to this. So the first thing is to address what you said, which is, when we jump from one thing to the next, it is a product disease I call pivotitis, where we're constantly pivoting from one thing to the next, right? Because it looks like the next shiny thing to try. And it's as prevalent in the corporate world as it is in personal life. So the way you avoid pivotitis is I think about things on two axes. The y-axis is the long term. Is this good for your vision or not? And the x-axis is survival. Is this good for survival or not? And in the corporate world, that survival axis might be financial survival or support from your boss. In your personal life, that survival axis might be, is this sustainable for me or not? And it might be financial. It might be just in terms of burnout, is this sustainable or not, right? And so in terms of vision versus survival, there are four quadrants that emerge. Things that are good for the vision and survival, those are the easy decisions. Mm-hmm. But I think especially when you're chasing a puzzle, there aren't too many things in easy decisions. There may be some things that are, and great if you're finding them. Sometimes you're investing in the vision. This is where it's good for the long-term vision, but it's not good for short-term survival. Training for a marathon might feel hard, and often it feels like investing in the vision. The opposite of that might feel like vision debt, where this is great for short-term survival, but it's not great for the long-term vision. An example of this might be that you're doing something where it gives you short-term gratification, but not long-term. In the long term, it's not great for survival. So short-term gratification might be that you're doing something that taking a break from your marathon training, like, oh, I don't feel like it, I'm just going to stay home today. Maybe it's not good for the long-term vision. On the other hand, right, it might also be that you're taking on vision debt in the form of you're pursuing goals that give you short-term gratification. Maybe it's you worked hard for that job title. In the short term, you got that job title, right? So it achieved that for you. It was financially, this made you more successful. So great for survival. But maybe in the long term, this was more harmful for your personal vision. If your personal vision was about your family life and the balance, etc. Maybe it's been vision debt from that perspective. What you're hearing from me is basically, depending on what your vision is and what survival means for you, these quadrants look, or what activities belong in what quadrants looks very different. So take some time to think about vision versus survival. And the way you avoid pivotitis is thinking about how you're balancing these different quadrants. Are you constantly just chasing the next shiny object? Is it feeling like vision debt? Because vision debt and too much investing in the vision both can lead to burnout. So think about how, if you're doing too much of both, then it might be burnout, etc. Or, you might be flitting between these quadrants because you're avoiding burnout. Think about it openly with curiosity. So that's the first piece of this answer in terms of how do you avoid just flitting between different things and avoiding pivotitis. And the second piece of this question is, when do you know it's time to quit? And that's a really deeply personal story. I had a startup, a wine startup, and I started in 2011. My kids were really little at the time. My son was still a baby. My daughter was 3, and I sold the startup in 2014 when she was 6. I realized that I needed to stop because my daughter was 6, and there was one day when she was angry at me, even in her sleep. I realized that I'd been working so hard. And even though, I was genuinely trying to spend time with my kids, at work, I would tell my whole team that from 3 to 6, I was unavailable. I was going to, go home and be with my kids. But the reality was 24/7, I was thinking about my startup. And I was also working in unsustainable ways. After my kids were in bed, I was working until like 1 or 2 in the morning. It was not sustainable for me, but I was doing this because I was chasing what I deemed as success. And I needed to make this startup profitable. I needed to make it successful, get that next round of VC funding, et cetera, et cetera. And I realized that I needed to stop, and it was time to not chase this puzzle when my daughter was angry with me in her sleep. I think sometimes only when it's too late, and it took us a year to recover as a family. But I think maybe one lesson from this is, don't wait until it's so late. I think now what I do is I assess more periodically, is this puzzle feeling fulfilling for me?
And it wasn't too late, so sometimes really is too late. So I'm glad that in your example it wasn't. I need to be mindful of our time, so I would ask you for the last question. What is your secret to a happy, fulfilled life? What is that puzzle?
And I think the answer goes back to what you asked me earlier, which we didn't get to, and I'm glad we get to it now, which is how do I define success? I remember when I wrote an essay for my application to MIT, the way I thought about success at the time, and that was sort of my title of the essay, I was so achievement focused at the time. Although I talked about it was the pursuit of those achievements that was success. In retrospect, I don't think that is success to me at all. Now, the way I define success to me is, what is that meaningful impact that I want to make? And to me, that answer isn't based on what society tells me. It's not about building a product that millions of people use. It's not about a job title. It's not about all of these, LinkedIn posts and followers, etc. It's not about those things. And when I wrote Radical Product Thinking, I felt like, to me, success was if even just a handful of really thoughtful people read this, and then they're making thoughtful decisions in terms of building products that create change in a way that is responsible, and it builds products that are good for society, creates the change that they envision, I would be happy. Right. So it's impact, but in a way that is deeply personal and meaningful. The one story that I will share in terms of the biggest learning of what success is, I talk about who's my role model. It's a woman who's now in her 80s. She's 80. She just turned 86 this year. Her name is Kate Beatty. Her title, when I got to know her about 30 years ago at MIT, her title was host to the International Host Student Program or something like that. Honestly, her title is meaningless because the impact that she had is nothing like the title. At her retirement party, There were people who traveled to it from long distances. And we were all crying at a retirement party, talking about the impact she'd had in our lives. I'll give you an example. I remember as a freshman at MIT, I was walking past her corridor, and I'd often walk into her office, and she would always invite me in, and I'd say, I just wanted to stop by and say hi. And she'd say, oh, come on in, how are you doing? And she would ask me. And it was only years later that I realized, she was sending emails at 2 a.m. So clearly Kate was busy. And so one day I asked her, how come you didn't just tell me to come back later? And she said, well, I know. I've learned from experience that when kids come to say hi, then I discover what's really going on in their lives. Like one kid maybe is really depressed. She learned about one student whose parent had passed away. She learned from them dropping by to say hi. And in my case, I remember that freshman year, she was the shoulder I cried on because I was so miserable and far away from home. Christmas was nearing. All these TV ads were reminding you about being with family, and the campus was deserted. And, she helped me through that when I was depressed. And she told me about one free round trip ticket that MIT gave students at the time. And that was the time when I needed it. Mm. And so this is the kind of personal impact we can have. It's not because of the job title. And if you think about how she's influenced my life and the number of people I've gone on to influence, we create impact through the personal relationships. Going back to my story about being the witness to other people's learnings, we create the impact through those personal relationships. Every single interaction that we have, whether it's on a plane, a coffee shop, at an airport, every single interaction. And we can be thoughtful about that. And the sum of all of these interactions is how I define success.
This is like a new leadership, like 3.0 if we were stuck in 2.0 before. Yeah, leading with the heart. If you can put one sentence on a billboard that every emerging leader would see daily, what would it be?
It's a quote that I found this year, which I really love. The quote goes, "We don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience." I think that's just so beautiful. We learn from reflecting on experience. Mm-hmm. Whether as leaders, in whatever way, we just often in life don't have time to reflect. And we realize how much of a difference that makes if we reflect and take time to reflect, how much we learn. And to me, that's really the key to all of puzzle setting and puzzle solving, being able to take that time to reflect.
Thank you, Radhika, for your time. Where can people find you? And your book?
The book Radical Product Thinking is in bookstores. It's on Amazon. And I'm working on my next book. So if you want to learn about puzzle setting and puzzle solving, you can download the OLA toolkit. I'll share the free toolkit link with you, which is on the Radical Product Thinking website. And people can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear your thoughts, experiences, etc., with puzzle setting, puzzle solving. And as I write the book, if you want to share your story, it might just make it into the case study. I would love to hear from you. And so, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Have a wonderful day and a lot of, not productive, but the right puzzle settings, puzzles that make a beautiful, beautiful picture in the end.
Thank you. It was so wonderful talking to you.
Yeah, same. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
You too.